You feel things in a way that is difficult to explain to people who do not experience it the same way. Not just more intensely, differently. The process itself is different. The way an emotion arrives, moves through you, stays longer than it should, connects to other things you were not expecting it to connect to. You have probably spent years assuming this was just how everyone experiences emotion and that you were simply less equipped to handle it. It is not a handling problem. What you experience is a genuinely different emotional processing style, one that psychology has studied extensively, named precisely, and found to be far more common among people with specific cognitive traits than most people ever get told. And understanding what it actually is changes not just how you see yourself, but how you understand every emotional experience you have ever had that felt excessive, confusing, or impossible to explain to someone else. But before we get there, there is one specific emotional experience that people who process this way have that nobody else fully understands. Something that happens in the aftermath of certain interactions, certain days, certain moments that most people move through without a second thought. An experience so specific and so consistently misread by others and by yourself that naming it precisely will feel like the first accurate description you have ever encountered. We will get to that. Stay with me. First, here is what your emotional processing is actually doing that most people's is not. Emotions in most people follow a relatively linear path. Something happens. A feeling arrives. It gets experienced at a manageable intensity for a manageable duration. Then it passes and the person moves on. The process is uncomfortable sometimes, but it is bounded. It has a beginning, a middle, and a relatively predictable end. Your emotional processing does not move linearly. When a feeling arrives for you, it does not stay contained to the event that triggered it. It expands, connects. It pulls in related feelings from other situations, other memories, other unresolved moments that carry a similar emotional signature. And what started as a response to one specific thing becomes a much larger interior experience that has no obvious boundary and no predictable endpoint. This is not emotional instability. It is not weakness or excessive sensitivity. It is what happens when an emotion gets processed at full depth rather than managed to a socially acceptable intensity and then set aside. The difference between what you experience and what most people experience is not a difference in emotional strength. It is a difference in emotional architecture. Here is the strange part. That architecture, the one that makes your emotional experiences feel so much larger and more complex than the situation seems to warrant, is the same architecture responsible for your capacity for genuine empathy, your ability to understand nuance that others miss, and your tendency to find meaning in experiences that most people move through without registering their significance. The depth is not the problem. The depth is the whole point. You just were never given the context to understand what the depth was actually for. Most people completely miss the connection between emotional depth and cognitive depth. They treat intense emotional processing as a mental health symptom rather than a perceptual style. They recommend management, regulation, distraction, reframing, without acknowledging that what is actually happening is not dysregulation but full processing. And there is a fundamental difference between those two things. Dysregulation is emotion running without direction. Full processing is emotion running all the way to its actual conclusion, which takes longer, covers more ground, and produces more interior disruption than the quick managed version. But it also produces something the quick managed version never does. Produces genuine resolution, not suppression, not distraction, not the temporary relief of having moved on before the feeling was actually finished. Real, complete, nothing left behind resolution that most people never experience because they stopped the process before it ran its course. And this leads directly to the specific experience I mentioned at the beginning. The one that happens in the aftermath of certain interactions and certain days that most people around you do not seem to be affected by at all. It is emotional residue. The specific experience of carrying the emotional weight of something long after the event itself has ended. A conversation that finished hours ago that you are still feeling in your body. An interaction that seemed minor that left an imprint you cannot quite shake. A day that looked ordinary from the outside that left you inexplicably depleted by evening. This is not you being dramatic. It is not you failing to regulate. It is the direct consequence of having processed that day, that conversation, that interaction at a depth that most people around you never went to. You felt more of it. so you are carrying more of it afterward. The residue is proportional to the depth of the processing, and your processing goes considerably deeper than average. Here is what most people in your life have almost certainly said to you at some point about this. Let it go. You are dwelling. It was not that serious. You need to stop letting things affect you so much. And every time someone said that, something in you knew they were missing something important about what was actually happening, but you could not quite articulate what they were missing. What they were missing is this. You were not choosing to dwell. You were finishing a process they had already stopped. The feeling was not done with you yet because you had not reached the end of it yet. And telling someone to let go of an emotion before their processing system has completed its cycle is like telling someone to stop digesting food. The instruction is not wrong because the person is stubborn. It is wrong because the process does not respond to instruction. But here is where it gets really interesting, because understanding this changes the entire way you should be relating to your own emotional experiences. If your emotional processing is not dysregulation but full processing, if the intensity and the duration and the complexity of what you feel is the natural output of a system running at full depth rather than a system running incorrectly, then the goal is not to feel less. The goal is to understand the process well enough to move through it without fighting it. Fighting it is what costs the most energy. The resistance, the self-judgment, the wondering what is wrong with you, the comparison to people who seem to process the same experiences in a fraction of the time, that is the exhausting part, not the feeling itself. Remember that specific emotional experience I described at the beginning, the residue, the weight that stays after the event has ended? Here is what that experience is actually telling you when it arrives. It is not telling you that something is wrong. It is telling you that your system has not finished yet, that there is more to process, that the event carried more emotional significance than the people around you recognized, and your processing system, which is considerably more thorough than average, is simply doing its job. The appropriate response to that signal is not to override it. It is to give it the space it is asking for. Not endless rumination, space, quiet, time away from new input so the processing can complete without being interrupted by the next thing demanding your emotional attention. That is not weakness. That is maintenance of the most sophisticated emotional processing system in the room. What you carry is real. What you feel is real. The depth at which you experience your own life is not a malfunction to be corrected. It is the thing that makes you capable of genuine understanding of yourself, of other people, of experiences that most people pass through without ever fully receiving. You do not process emotions incorrectly. You process them completely. And in a world that mistakes speed for health and brevity for strength, that distinction is worth understanding clearly, because everything about how you treat yourself changes when you finally do. Tell me in the comments. Is there a specific type of situation that stays with you longer than it seems to stay with anyone else around you? I want to know what your processing tends to hold on to most.